applaud and commend our dance ministry for the wonderful demonstration that they presented us with today that confirms and celebrates the series of sermons that we have been doing these last several weeks. We are in a season of discipline, and the object of that discipline that we have selected is that of the Ten Commandments. You can picture in your mind Moses, fresh from atop Mount Sinai, with the burning zeal of the Lord certainly impressed upon his face, as he comes back and he returns to God's people with a contract and a covenant that seals the relationship between he and them. I have stated to you before time that the first four commandments detail our relationship with God. It includes items like thou shalt have no other God before me. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Thou shalt not bow to idol gods. And the final six commandments have to do with a social contract, how we ought to treat one another. And on last week, I spent a considerable amount of time discussing with you, honor thy father and thy mother. And it is one of the few commandments where God gives Moses an extended explanation on why this commandment is important. He says, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long. Watch this. And that you might prosper in the land that I will give you. The next commandment, which is the centerfold of our attention today, is perhaps the shortest of the commandments. Thou shalt not kill. And I found it a bit more than coincidental that this commandment and the mandate to do no murder falls on this Sunday, where we are recovering from the lack of an indictment in Ferguson, Missouri. As you know, I have a fascination and a passion about history. And so it has not escaped me that in 1857, 157 years ago, there was a decision called the Dred Scott decision that took place in Missouri that helped to precipitate the Civil War that would happen 3 years later. The Dred Scott decision impacted race relations not only in that generation, but in several generations that followed. And here we are 157 years later, right back in the same state of Missouri. And this time, the lack of a decision will impact race relations not only in this generation, but in generations to come. That is why this afternoon is so very important. And that is why you need to understand that this discussion, this conversation, is not merely about Michael Brown. He may be the name that is attached and tagged to our current concern, but it's about more than a Michael Brown. It's about a pattern of unfair distribution of justice that has existed in this country for literally hundreds of years. I would remind you, 1955, the murderer of Emmett Till, no indictment. A few years later, early 1960s, the murderer of Medgar Evers, no indictment. Sean Bell in the neighboring county of Queens, no indictment. Now, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, no indictment. And we are holding our breath even this weekend as we prepare for a grand jury decision concerning Staten Island here in New York City. It was 1989. A sociologist by the name of Jawanza Kunjufu wrote a best-selling book entitled The Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. Jawanza Kunjufu argued in that work that the dismantling of our community's future is as old as the Bible itself. Let me remind you that Moses was put in a basket and floated down the Nile to escape being destroyed. A generation of his peers were the victims of genocide, and he escaped by riding the Nile. Let's not forget that Jesus, our Lord, was forced to escape to Egypt because Herod had decided that all male children below the age of 2 should die on the edge of the sword. Can I talk up in here? And I am convinced, as is Dr. Kunjufu, that there exists concerns, even in our country today, that's determined to make sure that we don't produce another Moses, and that there will be no new messiahs that will come from the loins of our community. That's why it is important that we stand up. That is why it is critical that I go to Ferguson, Missouri. That is why uplifted voices need to be voiced and heard, because, as I said earlier, it's about your son. It's about your grandson. It's about your nephew, your neighbor, your cousin. I'm spending this weekend with my grandson. And I don't want to grow up. I don't want him to grow up with me having to be afraid every time he steps out of his door. I ought not to fear his going to 7-Eleven. I ought not to have to be concerned that he will survive a visit to McDonald's. Let me give you an alarming statistic. In the last 2 years, 2013, 2014, we have lost more young men to excessive and deadly force by authoritarian forces in this country than we did lynchings in 1913 and 1914. No, you didn't hear me. I'm saying 100 years ago, when lynchings were common, we have lost more young lives today than we did 100 years ago during a season, an open season of strange fruit hanging from southern trees. And let me be fair, because this is not a one-sided conversation. And we have to take responsibility for ourselves and our community. And the harsh reality is that you are 3 times more likely to be victimized and killed by somebody who looks like you than somebody who looks like somebody else. And so there needs to be a conversation. There needs to be a heightening of our values. A conversation, a dialogue about the sanctity of life. Can I talk over here? Can I explain to you why God gave Moses this command? Why does God say, thou, and literally I'm using the literal manuscript here, thou shalt do no murder. shalt do no murder. Why would God insert that between honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt not steal? It is simple, beloved. And the reason is this. Don't take what you can't restore. The reason that murder is forbidden by the Mosaic law is because we can't give life. Death is permanent. Lie, you can recover from that. Steal, it can be returned. But once a life is taken, we have no ability to resurrect life. And beloved, life is precious. It is sacred. That's why God takes time to say, thou shalt commit no murder. Can I talk up in here? So when I look at the landscape of our lives and look at what we have to deal with, I say we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to each other. And then we have a responsibility to our God. We have a responsibility not to remain silent. I am reminded that it was Rosa Parks who, when she was interviewed years later and asked, what stuck you in that seat in Montgomery, Alabama? What caused you to refuse to move to the back of the bus? Everybody around you had already moved. And watch this. And you had moved yourself on many other occasions. What was it about that day that caused your response to be different? And Rosa Parks said, as I sat there on the bus, being abused verbally, being told to move with an assault on my citizenship, self-worth, and self-value, I saw the picture of Emmett Till in my mind. And I said, enough is enough. And on this day, I'm not going to move. Beloved, I'm saying enough is enough. We have lost too many bright young men. Enough is enough. We have victimized each other too long. Enough is enough. Unfair distribution of justice is not to be tolerated. Enough is enough. And I don't know about you, but I refuse to sit silent. I refuse to hush up my mouth. I refuse to ignore the obvious. Say yes. Say yes. Say yes. Is he all right? And so, Bishop, aren't you concerned that this is a holiday weekend? Aren't you concerned that this is a rivalry weekend? Army, Navy, Harvard, Yale, Georgia, Georgia State, UCLA, Stanford, Ohio State, and Michigan. Hello, somebody. Aren't you concerned that this is perhaps not spiritual? Aren't you concerned that this may smack of political and civic activism? Wait a minute, wait a minute. Aren't you concerned, Bishop, that people will ignore your appeal and you will show up on the steps of the first precinct by yourself, alone, unsupported? And my response is this. All of that is true. I don't deny nor debate any of what you say. But I say this. When God gives you an assignment, when instructions. When God gives you a mission, there's a song that we used to sing. If my mama won't go, if my daddy won't go, if my sister won't go, I'll go. If I have to go by myself, say yes, say yeah, say yes. I'll go, I'll go, I'll go, I'll go if I have to go by myself. But can I relieve your anxiety? Because I'm really not afraid of going by myself. Yes, some of you may choose to do something different. You may choose to be somewhere else. You may decide that this doesn't warrant your presence. But I'm not by myself, because if God told me to go, then God will go with me. Say yes. Come on, rest on your feet.